Good coffee. I switched. Good morning, by the way. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I'm trying out some new coffee. I normally drink Kona, which is awesome. Just recently, I ran onto some different Ethiopian. I like Ethiopian Javalia, uh, and this is a small custom outfit out of Texas. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but anyway, at a little flea market that my wife and I attended, I bought some. And at first, I didn't think I was going to like it, and then I discovered exactly how much coffee to brew. And boy, oh boy, I tell you what, and it's a whole lot cheaper than Kona, by the way. So, I mean, this is absolutely awesome. I'm really, really enjoying this. Well, there's your coffee tip for this morning. All right. Thanks so much for joining me here on Morning Musings. Uh, we are continuing our examination of the language of Matthew 24:29 and following. Now, let's not forget, folks, that the language of Matthew 24:29 and following is temporally delimited to the first century. And it's temporally delimited, or I would even say geographically limited, at least to a certain extent, to Judea. Why? Well, because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 and following, when you, that's his apostles, see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, set up in the holy place, know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Here is the abomination of desolation being set up in Judea. When they saw that, what were they supposed to do? What were the apostles supposed to do? Get out of Dodge. Let those who are in Judea flee. For then when? When the abomination of desolation would be set up. For then shall be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of creation until now. That's Jesus' the now time, nor ever yet shall be. So nothing like that tribulation had ever been, nor ever would be, if we take the language literally. Actually, it's just metaphoric, typical Hebraic, metaphoric, hyperbolic language. By the way, I have 3 articles on my website, donkpreston.com. You can just go there, read the articles for free as I examine the doctrine of the Great Tribulation in light of the claims of former preterist Sam Frost, who has made some utterly incredible false comments about the Great Tribulation. Nonetheless, the focus here is to realize that this Great Tribulation is Judea-centric. It's delimited temporally by the fact that the apostles would see it. If they're going to see the abomination of desolation, they're going to see the Great Tribulation because, after all, they're supposed to flee from it. And then Jesus says in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will be turned to blood, the stars of heaven shall be shaken, etc. Folks, we cannot ignore these audience relevance delimitations. And yet that's exactly and precisely what 99%, maybe less, of commentators do. It's really refreshing to see men like N.T. Wright, Scott McKnight, R.T. France, and others comment on that language and state and realize this is not talking about the literal destruction of heaven and earth. It's common Hebraic metaphor. Now, yesterday I began sharing with you Psalms 18 to demonstrate that language of Matthew chapter 24, 29 and following is typical Hebraic metaphor. All right, back to Psalms 18 then. David is being chased by Saul. Saul wants to kill him because Saul knows that David's going to be king. So Saul thinks he's got his life to be feared for. So he's going to make a preemptive strike and kill David. So he chases David. David said he prayed to the Lord. The Lord heard him. One more time now. The Lord heard my voice from his temple. My cry came before him, even to his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. Now watch this. He bowed the heavens also and came down. I got to tell you, a book written by a director of a Church of Christ preaching school some years ago wrote a book on the, quote, AD 70 heresy. And he said, well, clearly there is metaphoric language in the Old Testament to describe God's day of the Lord actions. However, what delineates Jesus' coming from those day of the Lord's coming is Jesus was going to come out of heaven. And he said, it's on paper. I've got the book in that library room right there. And he said there's nowhere in the Old Testament, speaking of those historical days of the Lord, in which it ever says God came down. Really? Let me see. Psalms 18. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and he came down. He came down with darkness under his feet. Oh, he rode upon a cherub, and he flew. He flew upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His canopy around him was dark waters and thick clouds of the skies from the brightness before him. His thick clouds passed with hailstones and coals of fire. By the way, doesn't that sound an awful lot like the epiphany of Yahweh on Mount Sinai? And by the way, in Deuteronomy 33, 1-2, Moses describing the vision, the scene at Sinai, says he, that's Yahweh, came with 10,000s of his saints. Really? Who saw 10,000 angels coming? Who saw 10,000 saints coming at Sinai? Well, there's no record of it except Moses describing the awesomeness of the display of God's power. Metaphoric language, folks. And now, verse 13 of Psalms 18. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered the foe, lightnings in abundance, and he vanquished them. Now watch this. You know, far as we know, David was nowhere near the Sea of Galilee or the Mediterranean in his flight from Saul. And yet, watch verse 15 of Psalms 18. Then the channels of the sea were seen. Foundations of the world were uncovered at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. The foundations of the sea? Folks, that's Exodus imagery in which the waters of the Red Sea were pulled back and Israel walked across on dry land. This is Israel's language. Hyperbolic, metaphoric language. This is David saying, I walked through the waters of deliverance. I walked through the waters where the Lord had provided a way of escape. He heaped up the waters, exposed the foundations of the sea, and I walked through in deliverance. So David is using the example of what literally happened in the Exodus and using it metaphorically. I hope you can see by now, and once again, folks, I've got to drive this point home. You have to see that Jesus' use of that language in Matthew 24, 29 and following was typical Hebraic, metaphoric, hyperbolic language. And here's what that means. That means for those who are appealing to these verses to talk about an end of time and the destruction of literal physical heaven and earth, They're just simply wrong. They're abusing the language. They're misinterpreting the language. They are ignoring the contextual source of the language. They are ignoring the audience relevance of the text that, as we just stated a few moments ago, is Judeo-centric, first century delimited. And I've been asking folks on Facebook to address that issue. I haven't received an answer yet, and I suspect I won't, because every futurist that I have shared this with knows that if you acknowledge, agree, and accept the first century temporal delimitation that the apostles were going to see the abomination of desolation, it's the apostles in that generation that were going to have to flee from that generation or from that tribulation. If you honor and accept the Judeo-centric nature of the abomination and thus the tribulation, then any futuristic application of Matthew 24, 29 and following completely is falsified. And it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus, as a good, faithful Hebrew, trained in these Old Testament prophecies and passages, was using that language as they well understood. And it was not literally. He was not predicting the destruction of literal, physical heaven and earth. And no, he wasn't doing that in Matthew 24:35. He's simply reiterating there what he said in verse 29 and following. So if verse 29 and following is metaphoric, that means verse 35 is metaphoric. Hey, thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We'll continue our examination of Matthew 24, 29 and following on the flip side. We'll see you there.